the way that individuals of a species are distributed around the world in different ecosystems is largely a result of ecological interactions and also, over broader amounts of time, evolutionary interactions. And ecological interactions include kind of the minute-to-minute time frame, so what's happening in an individual's day, what kind of organisms is it interacting with, what kind of landscapes and chemicals in the soil is it interacting with. But all of that comes together over evolutionary time, and those ecological interactions can affect evolution. For instance, we've talked in the past about Galapagos finches, and there was a well-documented drought on the Galapagos Islands in the 70s, and finches with larger beaks were more likely to survive the drought because they could crunch the larger seeds that were still around. And that's an ecological interaction, right? That's them interacting with the abiotic factors in terms of lack of moisture and the biotic factors in terms of which seeds are available. But those ecological interactions over time, over generations, led to a change in the average beak size of Galapagos finches, and that is evolutionary change. So ecological interactions over time contribute to evolutionary change, and there are both biotic and abiotic factors that influence species distribution in an ecological way. So climate, interactions with other species, those are biotic, and all sorts of other things. So here you see the kangaroo, and kangaroos are very common in Australia, but not all over Australia. And this shows you kind of where you see them most, and it's primarily down here when you see these darker colors, greater than 20 per kilometer squared. That's a lot of kangaroos. And then this dotted line is sort of their outer distribution overall, with more or less in different parts of the country. Well, why do you find kangaroos in some areas of Australia, but not others, or at least less densely distributed in other areas? In other words, where do species occur, and why do they occur there? Well, there are a series of questions that ecologists can work through to figure out maybe why a species is or is not in a particular area. So if you want to know why is a particular species absent from an area, it may come down to a limit on distribution. So let's say we're looking at an island in the middle of the ocean. Well, maybe a particular organism can't cross water, at least large amounts of water, and so it's not going to find its way to an island in the middle of the ocean. That's just a dispersal limitation. But maybe that's not the case. Maybe we're talking about a bird that can fly across great expanses of space. And so there is no dispersal limit, but it's still not found on this island. Why? Well, the next question is, does something about its behavior limit the distribution? Maybe this is a bird that requires a big migration, right? They've evolved to migrate over time, and this is a small island. There's not enough space for migration. Or maybe they need a big territory, and there's not enough space on the island for a territory. But let's say that's not the case. There are no behavioral limitations that we can ascertain that are limiting its distribution to this island. Maybe there are biotic factors. Maybe there's another bird there that already eats the stuff that it would eat, right? And outcompete it. Or maybe the thing that it eats isn't there at all. Maybe it requires a particular kind of rat. Maybe it's a carnivorous hunting bird, right? It's some sort of hawk. And there just aren't rats or mice on this island. It doesn't have anything to eat, right? That is a biotic factor that could prevent it from living on that island. Or maybe there are no other biotic factors, right? Which could include a predator that eats it up, or a parasite that takes it down, or some sort of disease. Maybe there's not a biotic factor. Well, there might be abiotic factors, right? Maybe this island is too cold or too hot for this particular bird. Maybe the soil structure is wrong. Maybe a particular plant requires fire, and this doesn't have any fire, or it's too dry, or it's too wet. Lots of abiotic environmental reasons why you may not find a particular organism in a particular spot. There are also cases where if dispersal has been a limitation, and it's no longer a limitation anymore, you can find some sort of adaptive radiation, right? So cattle egrets arrived in the Americas in the late 1800s with human settlers, and now they've expanded their distribution widely in North America. Or, in the case of Hawaiian silver swords, they descended from an ancestral plant, which is the North American tarweed. And it took a lot of random chance for that tarweed to wind up landing in the Hawaiian Islands. But once it did, right, by luck, then all of a sudden you had all these islands with very different selective pressures and a small population. And so you end up with a lot of drift, and you end up then with this adaptive radiation. And now there are several different species of Hawaiian silver swords on the different islands of Hawaii that are quite different from the North American tarweed. Sometimes species end up transplanted in a different place, often accidentally, sometimes intentionally. Like kudzu, for instance, was planted in the southeastern United States to hold back erosion or as a nice plant to look at. And once that transplant happened, it was wildly successful. And now that's an invasive species. But that indicates that the potential range of kudzu was much larger than its actual range was. There was something holding that back. It was dispersal. Now humans have assisted with that dispersal, and it's doing quite fine in the southern United States. Biotic factors that could preclude an organism from living in a particular area might be predation or herbivory or competition, right? Maybe there's a predator that lives on the east bank of a lake or of a river that doesn't live on the west bank of the river. And so maybe this organism then lives on the west bank of the river and not the east, so they don't get eaten up. Any individuals that happen to move to the east side of the bank get eaten, don't survive. Or herbivory if you're a plant, which is essentially predation on plants. Or competition. There might be on the other side of the river an organism very similar to you that can't cross the river. It can't disperse across the river. But it's better than you at eating the things you eat or taking advantage of the habitat you take advantage of. And so you are outcompeted from that area. Those are biotic factors because they're living things that are causing those limitations. For example, urchins have a huge impact on the distribution of seaweeds, especially in the California coast. And if you have a control where urchins and limpets are present, for instance, if we're comparing the impact of these two, you have essentially no seaweed cover because they eat it all as it comes up. If you remove the limpets and you only leave the urchins, you still have essentially no seaweed. Now, if you remove both, you've got lots of seaweed. But even if you only remove the urchins, you still have a fair amount of seaweed. So urchins are the primary organisms that have this biotic influence on the distribution of seaweed. And there are lots of abiotic factors too. Temperature, water, sunlight, winds, how rocky is the soil, how sandy or silty is it, what sort of nutrients do you find in the soil. And those things can vary in both space or in time. Temperature has a huge impact on biological processes. Below freezing, cells can freeze because they're made primarily of water and rupture above 45 degrees C, so very hot. Proteins can begin denaturing. So unless you've adapted ways to deal with those particular issues, you may have a tough time being in a very cold or a very warm place. And a lot of mammals and birds expend energy to regulate their internal temperature. So it's going to be difficult. It's going to be a lot more energy expended if you get outside of your normal range. Because we need water for basically all of our cellular processes, right? It's the solution of life. And because plants require it for photosynthesis, water availability is a huge factor in species distribution. To be in an area with very little water, you need to have very particular adaptations for that, right? So you can't take a tropical rainforest organism and place it in the desert and expect that it will do well, right? So those sorts of abiotic factors can limit distribution. Similarly, if you take a desert organism that spends a lot of energy on structures and processes that conserve water and place it in a rainforest, right? It may waste energy on those things and get outcompeted by the rainforest organisms. Or if it's a plant and you place it in a bog where there's lots of water, there may not be as much oxygen available for its roots, and it's not adapted to that. As we've talked about, osmoregulation is very different if you are in, for instance, salt water versus fresh water, or if the soil is higher or lower in its salinity. And this is why you tend to find very different fish in freshwater or in salt water. You can't just pick up a shark and put it in the middle of, Lake Michigan, right? That doesn't tend to work. There are some organisms that are adapted to, a varying amount of salinity, and you tend to find in those estuaries, but those are very specific organisms with very specific adaptations. Some organisms have evolved well to deal with shade and longer wavelengths of light. Others can't deal with that. They need direct sunlight. And so you may do well on the north or the south end of a hill or a mountain, for instance, or in a desert if you like direct sunlight versus, in the underbrush of a temperate broadleaf forest. Here you can see the tree line on a mountain. And this is a very stark difference that you can see with your eyes in terms of distribution of these trees. And there are several things going on here, right? It's colder as you move up. Also, you have less protection from UV light, which can harm organisms that aren't adapted to it, especially big ones like trees. And water becomes less available because more of it is frozen and evaporates from the sun as well. And so you end up with a very distinct tree line, a place where tree distribution is limited. And lastly, we've talked a lot about plants recently. Some plants require a lot of nitrogen. Some plants don't. They can fix their own nitrogen with the help of their rhizobacteria. Some plants do better in a more acidic or a more alkaline soil, depending on what their needs are and the way that they deal with particular amounts of hydrogen ions, and also mineral composition. Right? Is there a lot of phosphate? Some organisms, some plants do well in sandy soil, physical structure. Some do well breaking up really clay-filled soil. So all these abiotic factors can also limit distribution.